percentage of rye flour do I use? I'd say I use rye flour primarily in my starter at a ratio of maybe 5 to 10%
Okay,
of
that
the
makes
flour
sense.
that I use.
Thank you.
So if I'm feeding it, let's just say if I'm feeding it with 50 grams of flour, which is pretty standard, only 8 to 10 grams of flour would be rye flour.
Thank you for that.
Okay, so what I want to do is I know that a lot of people in here are in different stages of this process. And so I want to just sort of like start at the very beginning and just sort of like just walk through it kind of quickly, but I think it'll help put everything into place that you may have heard and maybe don't quite get yet or whatever, okay? So here I am. I'm going to keep watching these bagels because we'll have a few more in here. So here I am. I'm ready to say I want to create a starter or I want to get a starter. To create a starter, what I'm going to do is I'm literally going to take, I have flour here in a little bag that I'm going to feed it with. I take a little bit of flour and a little bit of water and I put it in a container like this. Or you do a little ball jar or something, right? I literally let it sit there for 24 hours at 80 to 90 degrees, ideally. If it's 70 degrees, it might take 48 hours, right? I mean, these are the nuances of it. And what it means exactly is there's no answer to exactly with this. It's all you figuring it out. So there's the oven. The picture there is the pizza oven making these whole grain sourdough loaves. So equal parts flour and water together, 24, maybe 48 hours, depending on the temperature, and you let that go. After 24 or 36 or 48 hours, and you feel like maybe something's happening or it's starting to really look weird, you say, okay, I'm going to pull some of that out. Let's just say I'm going to pull 50 grams out. Then I'm going to put in 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water, right? 1, 1, 1. That's an easy thing to remember. And you put that together and then you let it go. Again, 24 hours, 36 hours, 48 hours. And I would say you do this for maybe 2 or 3 or 4, maybe 5 cycles. If you did it for 3 or 4, you're likely to see what's described as a bloom, meaning that there's an element of natural yeast that's in the air that is short-lived, that kind of will cause it to pop up and sort of look like it's really doing its thing. But then if you keep doing it, it'll just go back down. Like the next feeding, it won't rise up as much. And so what you're cultivating is, I'll call it the stable yeasts that are in the air, right?
What did you do with the pot you took out?
I threw it away. Yeah. I'd say that there's not a whole lot to do with it except that you could put it in pancakes, any other kinds of things that you can put it in for fun. A lot of times, people who are making a lot of sourdough with the discard, they find things to put it in as opposed to saying, oh, I want pancakes this morning, let's make sourdough starter just for pancakes. Almost never that happens for a person who's making the sourdough starter because you always got this extra that you're discarding, okay? So the discard, you throw away, you feed it a little bit with flour and water, and you move on to the next day. And after a week, I'd say you've got something going. It may not be like this, and it probably won't be, but you've got something going after a week. Got a little dark. Some people like it dark. Rustic char. At the wheel, we call it rustic char. That means it's kind of burnt, but it's kind of New Haven style. So people love it. And we just anything that's dark, you just say it's got char, and everybody's all like, yeah, I'm into that. Okay. So you've got the starter going. Now is the time to turn it into something that's stable, consistent, and predictable, right? That's the next phase. The first phase is like the creation part, and it's like you're hopeful and kind of trying to make some educated guesses about it, but in the end, you're looking for something that you can count on to do its thing, and its thing is to rise bread. That's its purpose. So you start, at some point you say, okay, I'm going to start my regular process, and you say, okay, in this case, I might modulate that ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 2 parts, 1 part starter, 2 parts flour, and 2 parts water, right? So if I'm measuring that out, that looks like 10 grams of starter, 20 grams of flour, 20 grams of water. Again, this is just hypothetical because it really does come down to what you're seeing, what you're guessing, what you're trying to make sense of this. And you go, maybe you go a couple of days like that, and in that process of going a couple of days like that, you see it start to say, okay, yep, it's going up to this mark, not very high, and it's coming back down. It's starting to get predictable, it's starting to be something you can count on. And you can see that I got this rubber band on here, and mine goes up, and mine still isn't really descending yet. So at some point, you see its vitality, and you say, oh, I feel like I've really got something that's beginning to be stable, and you maybe another 3 or 4 days go by, and now you're really ready to make bread with it. I'd say at that point, you can continue to maintain it, or you can make bread with it, or both, right? One reality of sourdough is that you're, in theory, always maintaining, because you don't ever want to have to start from scratch again, because waiting a whole week of guessing and hoping and kind of having your fingers crossed that it's going to do its thing is not what you want to have to do all the time. So you want it, once it gets going, it's fun to, like, I don't know, it's a little bit like a little dog or something. Like you want it to be happy, right? And so you do what you can to maintain it, and in a sense, you never use all of it to start a bread loaf, for example. If you were to use all of it and make it into all of it in bread, then it would be gone, and you'd have to start over the next time you wanted to do it. You don't want to do that. So this process of maintaining it becomes a ritual, daily little, what do you call it?
It's just got something you gotta do.
It's maintenance.
Yeah, it's maintenance. It's the part that is the little ritualistic and a little like yoga or something like that. You know, like it's the zoning out part. So here it is. It's time for me to feed this thing, and I'm going to just go through the process, and then if you have questions about that, it's pretty straightforward. But you've already heard it, I feel like, a bunch of times. But I think seeing it in action is easy. So what I do, I could do it in 5 minutes. I just turn on my little scale and I zero out my bowl. What you'll see here is if I do this, I can poke this thing, and it's like a lot of air. It's like all puffed up in there. You can smell it. It's really powerful smelling, and it's all like striated and stretchy, and air's coming out of it. It smells sour. Yeah. Does anybody want to smell it?
It smells good.
It's smelly.
Yeah, go smell it.
It's why it's called sourdough.
When it's happy, it smells good. When it's really cute, it doesn't smell so good.
Yeah.
It's nice though. Also, there's a lot of.
No, it's lovely.
So it's vibrant and it's smelly.
It's lovely, isn't it? Yeah.
It smelled more right when I opened it up. But again, all the part that's smelling is all those little air bubbles in there that it's exhausting this gas that's taking the dough that's around it, and it's going like a little balloons, and like thousands of little balloons in there is what causes it to rise. And that's why bread rises. So here I am. I'm just going to take 10 grams. In this case, I know about what 10 grams feels like. So I'm going to just drop it in there. That's 13. 13 is fine.
That's what I do.
Again, it's super arbitrary, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I need to get water, and my water needs to be somewhere between 90 to 105 or 110. This is hot water here. It's so hot that I wouldn't really want to get in it. And that makes me think it must be 108.
Do you use filtered water?
I don't. I use Eugene water.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, we're pretty good. You got a good fit here.
I'd say I tend to be a kind of a no-nonsense. Like if something feels like I'm not sure it's going to help and it's the easy way, I'm going to go the easy way.
Can you repeat the temperature up to 110?
Yeah, they say it. I think it's even like up to 119. Well, not.
Okay, I've been doing mine too cold then.
So I got a fun little thermometer. If you don't have one of these, all it takes is having one for a month, and you get a pretty darn good sense of it. I can set this in here, and I can tell you that this one's going to be whatever, 105 degrees, 107 degrees maybe. It probably won't be that hot.
Hot tub.
104. 104. Okay. So I'm gonna it's at 13.
How do you know how much water? Did you measure?
I'm on the scale.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So I'm looking at. I got a whole bunch of warm water at 105. It's a good number, and I'm gonna put it on here, and I've got 13 in there. I could zero it out, but I can add. so I can go from 13, and I want to add. Well, let's just imagine it's 10, because I don't have to do the extra math. I want to add 5 parts. So if that's 10, I want to add 50 of this. So I'm going to go to 63. And again, it's not rocket science. If it happens to be a little bit over or under, I'm at 64. That's fine. So I've got this is that flour. This is that I would say that I've heard and have experienced that relatively recently ground flour is better. So local flour in that regard might be better than some Pillsbury flour, but all-purpose flour, unbleached all-purpose flour would do the job. And in this case, I've got some locally grown Edison flour in here and a little bit of rye flour. And if you don't know it, there is a local stone grinding mill that's right here in town called Camas Country Mill, and they've got all kinds of flour. So, ideally, you work fast enough that your scale doesn't reset. But if it does, it's like, what was that number again? And how much of this do I need? Like sometimes you're ready to do the math, and you have to back off and do the math a different way or whatever. But that's sort of the nature of it.
50 grams.
So in this case, I'm still fine. My scale's still on. I've got a clean spoon, and I'm just going to pop it up to what?
63.
Well, it's at 64 now. I'm going to add another 50, so we're talking 114. So you can see it. Maybe it looks like a lot, but again, I talk about it like it's like numbers are particular. They're not very particular. Everything is about the flexibility of it all. And I think when you're trying to figure out what might be going wrong, maybe paying extra attention to it is good. If, for example, if I wanted to, I could stir it with this one with this extra starter on here that might add a little more to it. Or I could try to scrape more of it off. I'd say it's just kind of like, what is it do you think it needs? Do you think it is needing more food? And how you would know that would be the timing of it. In the sense that, okay, it's been 12 hours. And the reason why 12 hours is important, because it's not important. 12 hours doesn't matter at all. But it does mean that I can count out in my head, 8 o'clock in the morning is about when I should do it, and then 8 o'clock at night is another time that I'm available and I can do it. Because if it's me guessing and only ever looking at the dough itself to judge, and not trying to create a cycle, I may have to wake up at 2 in the morning to feed this thing, and that would be stupid. Okay? So the goal isn't just some made-up thing that this stuff actually takes 12 hours to do its thing. You actually are training it to go 12 hours so that you can count on the regularity of doing it at such and such and such and such. So in Alaska, maybe they don't do it every 12 hours. Maybe they let it go longer, and in that process of going longer, especially if they let it go way longer and it happens to be a warm day, the sun's shining, it gets a little more sour, right? So it's all these things that are like, it's all just woo.
So what's your favorite thing to do with the discard? Because you now have this small amount of starter that you're mixing.
Yeah, all this other part here is for you guys. So that's what I'm going to do with this starter.
Oh, I love you for that.
Oh, yeah.
Woo-hoo.
I'll just give you a little story. When we were getting ready, when I first got brought into the wheel, I was asked to create this sourdough starter, and the folks there had already kind of created one, but it was not going good. And it was very interesting because they didn't know much about it, and they weren't bakers. So they were talking about a brew guy, a guy who does beer, and we're talking about a restaurant manager, and we're talking about a chef who doesn't like to bake. And they're like trying to fiddle around, trying to hope that they can pull this together without anybody who's into it, really. And so they're like, what should we do? What should we do? And for whatever reason, when I got there, they literally had, okay, imagine this thing here. Two of these full of this like liquid that had flour in it. It was like, it wasn't like dough, it was more like what they call a
Slurry?
a slurry, and it stunk, right? And they're like, oh, we're gonna put some flour in it and a little water, and I don't know what they were doing because I wasn't around, but that's what I got started with. It was like, it isn't bubbling, it doesn't, like, nothing about it looks like it's doing what it's supposed to do. And they certainly couldn't use it that way in the sense that it, like, it was this big, like, 2-gallon thing.
Now you went
That sounds
from,
horrible.
You went from 111 to 155.
Yeah.
Okay, but so when you're first starting to create one, it's 111.
Yeah.
And when you're maintaining, it's 155.
I think that's correct.
Thank you.
I own mill my own flour,
Yeah.
and so they talk about if it's a little bit too coarse, if your flour is a little coarse, it can ruin. Can it ruin your starter? 'Cause I know it can ruin a loaf.
Yeah, I would say that I don't have a lot of experience milling my own stuff. I would say that I have tried it, and I do know that freshly milled flour is supposedly better for the vitality of the starter. I think that the details of how well it's ground is something I just can't really say. My sense would be that it would be good, but you wouldn't want to use a whole lot of it, because I mean, one thing I know is that the more it gets processed or the more that it gets milled, makes more sugars available for the starter, right? And so let's just say if you use the refined white flour in there solely, you might be able to use that and add some of your flour in there, and it would create that vitality that we're looking for, where you got energy and the yeast enzymes that are naturally occurring. Where if you just use one, yours, you might not have the fuel, and it might not do what it does, and it certainly might not have the elasticity because of all the extra bran and that part in it. But then that's why we're not feeding it, I would say, normal whole wheat flour.
But if it's a little bit too coarse of a grind, they talk about how that can pierce the gluten and prevent it from rising.
Yeah, I'd say that again, I don't know the answer to that. Okay?
So you probably want refined grind.
Yeah, these are the two of the last recent discards, and so you smell that smell that you smelled before, same thing. It's not very old because it's been sitting in the fridge in between, so I would say it's pretty much the same as this, except that this has been refrigerated for 1 day. So it's two little segments. So the start that I'm going to put in here is going to go in here, and normally I might just throw this in the trash. Because what I do with this is, things like pancakes are good, or it's good for, but there's not a whole lot of other things. I don't know. I think there's probably, you could read up a whole lot more, but I haven't done a ton of research on what I should be doing with my discards.
When you do bread, you always like peak, and then when you're not.
Gotta speak up, James.
You're gonna have to.
Yeah, I think my opinion on making it into pancakes would be that you could look up a recipe for sourdough pancakes and use it that way. You could probably just wing it. I would say I've winged it 1,000 times, and you can't hardly mess up pancakes. You know what pancakes are supposed to sort of be like.
Paul, can you use, other than regular flour, some of the alternatives such as potato flour for those that have celiac or gluten intolerance?
I think the answer is, well, I do know that one of the reasons why wheat flour is good is primarily because of the gluten. And so the gluten is the issue associated with why you might want to use another flour, meaning no gluten, because you might have celiac or even a gluten intolerance. So the gluten makes for the elasticity in the bread, And that elasticity is what helps it to rise, right? So you got the yeast happening, developing the culture and maintaining a starter with something other than wheat flour is something that I don't have a lot of experience with.
Okay.
I think
I have a quick, there's a site called the Art of Gluten-Free Baking.
Yeah.
And she has a recipe for making gluten-free starter. And she also has a mix, and some people who are also allergic to potato and corn, a lot of people with celiac are.
Yeah.
And so she's got her mix, starter mix without any potato or any corn in it.
Yeah. So again, the basic idea of starter, where you're adding it has some sugars that can be consumed by the natural occurring yeast in the air, being facilitated. I would say I just don't have experience with it, but I think you should be able to read about it.
The art of gluten-free baking, did you say was yours?
Art of glutenfreebaking.com.
I also just wanted to add really quick too that my friend is gluten-free. She makes her really sick, and she uses einkorn flour, which is like really low in gluten, and it's the only like grain flour that can be tolerated. So I would highly recommend looking into that.
What's it called again?
Einkorn.
Einkorn.
EINKORN. And there's another one called Emmer. It's more of like an ancient wheat that is, even though it's a wheat that has gluten in it, it's so different than current modern wheat that it's often more tolerated. Spelt is another one that doesn't have gluten, but acts and operates very similar. So it's surprisingly, you can add spelt to a loaf of bread at 50% or 60% of the flour that you're putting in, and it doesn't. You wouldn't even necessarily think that it was something other than wheat. And I would say it's also true that a lot of folks who are gluten intolerant have tried the wheels pizza, and just by the nature of the 72-hour ferment and the fully sourdough starter, they're not having trouble with it. We've had lots and lots of people come in and say, this is the only pizza I can eat at school. Why is that? I think it's because of that 72-hour ferment. You know, you won't go to any other pizzeria in town that has that. Typical scenario would be that they're making dough today, they're either using it tonight or tomorrow.
So the fermentation is doing something to the flour that makes it more.
I think the answer is, I don't know the details of the biochemistry of it, but I think the answer is yes. Yeah, go ahead.
My understanding is it changes the protein, and most of us that react to wheat are typical and it heats, it makes it change that more easily and more absorbable in the sourdough.
Yeah. So you can see here that I added it at 10, 50, and 50. It's made what is described as a 100% mixture, meaning that there's in here should be 100% water and 100% flour, or equal parts. In the end, the ratio that I use of current new flour and current new water to the existing is that 5 to 5. But that constant thickness of like how hard it is or how much liquid it is still a 50-50 relationship, and it always is, and there's never anything else ever added to this. For example, you don't ever add sugar, you don't ever add salt, you don't ever add oil of any kind. It's always just flour and water, and it should always be about this thick. Like if I turn it upside down, I might not ever have to catch it. It's a relatively thick thing. I can lower my little rubber band to try to get a guess on where this one's going to rise up to. I don't need to really. I know how it's going to do. For you guys, I would suggest if you're getting started and you're trying to do an efficient way of doing it, this size of a container isn't fully necessary. The smaller the better. I've even done it in a little pint ball jar.
Yeah.
And you can do it with 5 grams and 5 grams. Because of that exponential growth, if you know you're going to make bread tomorrow, you can rev it up and then put it in that last stage right before you do it. But the maintenance part doesn't require using a lot of flour and stuff.
But you want a lid on it?
Yeah, you want a lid on it. You want it to not be tight. They say you can put a fabric on it. Fabric, most people don't put fabric. They just like a loose fitting lid.
So, let me make sure I understand. It's when you're rejuvenating it, it's 1 quart flour to 5 parts water, and then 5 more parts flour.
Yeah. Again, those numbers are all just sort of like, someone came up with them and they're working, and that seems to be a good number for 12 hours and 12 hours. If you know, if you're feeding it every 24 hours, that's a cyclical way of doing it, which is a total valid way. Again, you'd see that if you went to sourdough.com, you'd probably see hundreds of people, thousands of people recommending 1-to-1-to-1. Nothing, again, it's nothing wrong with any particular way of doing it. It's about learning the way that you should do it. Yeah, I think that's some of this. So now I've got that. I fed that. I'm going to keep that. That's my starter for 12 hours. And it'll, you know, tonight at 8 o'clock, or in this case, closer to midnight, unless I put it in a warmer environment, it's going to be about midnight. This one, on the other hand, is right starter, ready to roll. If I wanted to weigh this, and if I knew how much this container weighed, I'd be able to just set that on there. Okay, this is 300 grams, and I can make something worth 300 grams right now. Let's just say that that's what I wanted to do. I would take this and I put it in a bowl. I put, let's just say if I'm gonna make up a recipe. 300 grams of water. No, 300 grams of starter is gonna need 450 grams of water, and it's gonna need about 800 grams of flour. And I can mix my flours for what I want to do. If I want a whole grain loaf, or if I want a pizza bread or bagels, I can choose what flours I want. If I am making different kinds of bread, I will change the hydration level. And that means, well, how much flour to water in the final mix. So hydration is a big deal. And what they call baker's percentages is something that is a common way of referring to them. And they'll say that if something is 100% hydration, well, that's not all water, just so you know. That means that the amount of water to flour is equal, 100%. So everything is based on how much water you put in. If you put in the same amount of flour, then you get a certain thing. I'm sorry. Everything is based on the amount of flour that you put in and how much water then you add in weight. So a 60% hydration is, I would say, kind of a typical hydration for making regular loaves of bread. You might go a little bit higher, especially if you're wanting to create a lot of elasticity and things. You can go up as high as 75%, quite a bit higher. Pizza, depending on how hot the oven is, can be even lower conceivably. It might be from 65 to 58%. So these are just nuances of how you kind of want your dough and how it's going to react with the heat that you're going to hit at it and how you're going to hit it. And so let's just say I put 300 grams of starter in, my 450 grams of water, and a bunch of flour, and I mix it up. I add salt, and I don't think I need to add anything else most of the time. Most breads that I make don't need oil or sugar.
How does that mix up when it's so sticky?
Yeah, well, that's why what I typically do is I put this out in a bowl, and then I pour the warm water over it, and then I sort of dissolve the starter in the water, so it becomes a full liquid. Yeah. And then I put in the flour, and then I mix it up, and I quickly just sort of assemble everything. And you've probably heard someone say, "No knead bread." I've got a strong opinion on this.
Yeah.
Bread does not need to be kneaded. What happens in bread is something called hydration, and that you mix water and flour, and at first it doesn't do anything. Like they're still relatively two separate pieces. They haven't melded at all. The flour hasn't actually gotten any water into it yet. I mean, it's still like parts, right? So as you're mixing it, it pulls apart. It's all chunky and things like that. But over time, over 10 minutes, there's a process called autolyse, where you may put the water and the flour together before you add the starter and let it just sit for 20 minutes or half an hour and let it hydrate, right? That hydration is what creates the elasticity. In my mind, the whole kneading process is almost irrelevant. It has to do with time. So you can mix it and then let it sit 10 minutes, and it would be just like you kneaded it for another 10 minutes. There's no difference.
A show on TV, a newsstand cook. He was in a grinding mill in Norway or something.
Yeah.
He just took flour and added water in a plastic container, put it in his backpack, and then 24 hours later came out red dough.
Yeah.
They called it sourdough.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in theory it would be, in the sense that it's beginning to ferment a little bit, just in the nature of having sugars with water and then sitting there waiting to be fulfilled, and fermentation happens. That would be a good t-shirt.
I don't want to carry mine around for 24 hours.
So in that regard, no need is one of these like phrases that people like because it means that you don't have to do anything. The answer is you do have to do something. You do have to know what you're doing. You need to know about how long to wait, and you need to be able to know when to, let's say, give it some structure. The structure happens in kneading, and so kneading works. So there's nothing wrong with kneading, but I don't think you really need to knead it a lot. And so what I typically do is I'll put these ingredients together and whip it up in that dough machine right there, and I literally let it, set for 5 minutes and pull it out. It doesn't need to be in there any longer. And in that process, on the table, I might fold it over a few times, what they call a stretch and fold. You've also maybe heard the slap technique. Have you ever heard that? Mm-hmm. It's a cool technique. I've not really done it much, so I'll show you how it works. You grab the dough, you throw it down, smash it on the table, and then you take it and then you stretch it over.
Yeah.
And then you can pick it up again and you smash it down. That's a slap technique. It's cool visually. Like, you people, I think it's like hype. It's all cool. I don't do it.
That's why we make dodos to get all our impressions out.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with slap. I don't think there's anything wrong with the slap technique, but I don't think you need to slap it all day long. So you mix it, you let it set, you maybe do some stretch and folds over the first half an hour, maybe even hour, depending on how long your rise is going to be. Some stretch and folds, meaning that you just grab the dough, you pull it toward you, and you put it back onto itself. Maybe you take it the other direction, you do it the other way. If it's in a bowl, it's pretty easy to do. Then boom, it's all stretch and fold, and now it's ready to do its rise. And in that process, what you've done is you've taken the gluten structures in there and you kind of layered them in a way that will help them to be more resilient and to do the stretching. Because the stretching is what makes the bubbles do what they do. If the gluten wasn't stretchy, you'd have all this air getting released in there and it would just pop and it would deflate. As soon as it popped, it would chew. But that stretchiness creates the bubbles, and it's like a bunch of little balloons. So that happens for usually anywhere from a half an hour to 12 hours, depending on how much starter you put in it, right? You go through that phase where it's doubling in size. I would say that is a characteristic that almost all recipes use of how much it should really rise in its elasticity, regardless of how long it takes, again, depending on how much starter you're using. So let it double in size. It'll be real poofy and soft and fun. And what you do is you can just pop it, push it down, fold it back into a ball, and let it go again, or you can divide it out into small amounts. And when I say let it go again, often that means the second rise would mean that you made just the right amount for a loaf, right? Because how big of a loaf can you really make? What if you had to make a loaf in this? It would be a giant thing. It would be hard to cook. You couldn't get it in the oven. But if you made one that was 700 grams, well, then it's just a matter of folding it over until it's ready, letting it rise, pushing it down, rolling into a ball again, letting it rise a second time. The second time is usually about half of the length of time it took to do the first one. That's very common rule of thumb that almost all bread recipes have, would be that the first rise is one time, second rise is about half of that. Then, depending on where you're at in that process, you're either shaping it as a final shape, or you're putting it in the oven at that phase. So with pizza, you're balling it up in like little 300 or 400 gram balls, and you're putting it in these little trays, and it's sitting there in the refrigerator at that point or you can ball it and shape it, put it in here, and let it sit at room temperature for that second rise. There's lots of little things that you can figure out how to do depending on what your needs are.
After the second rise, it can go right in the oven. It doesn't.
That's when it should go in the oven. I would say it should go in the oven, or it should go in the refrigerator. And depending on how long that time is, if it goes in the refrigerator, it's going to stay at that warm temperature that your room is for a little longer in the fridge. So you might put it in the fridge a little bit earlier than a full half of what that time was in the first rise.
Paul, when I do a second rise, I usually, if I don't have time, I'll do the process, get it ready in a ball, and then I put it in the fridge and then take it out. Is that the wrong approach? Should you let the second rise happen to a certain point and then put it in the fridge?
I think it doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you.
I think that you've got the freedom to evolve and figure out what you've got, where your time allows you to punch in and punch out of the process. And as long as you understand the temperature and if you've done it enough,
Yeah.
then you get it. If you haven't done enough, you're trying it and you're like hopefully documenting well enough that you can do better the next time. I mean, that really is bread baking, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I always find the second rise is where you put in the fridge if you need a break.
Yeah.
Is that typical?
I would say typically when I'm making a really good, making as many, regular sourdough loaves that I'm wanting, I'd say what I typically do is I let it rise for 6 hours. I shape it and put it into a boule, right out here.
Yeah.
One of those little bannetons, and then I put a bag over it, or I cover it somehow, put it in the fridge until it's time to bake, which is usually the next morning. I like baking first thing in the morning, right when I'm feeding my starter. And so I'll pull it out, pop it into this little thing. We're really close on time, so I'm kind of rushing through this. But this little thing right here,
Dutch oven.
Yeah,
Dutch oven?
Dutch oven, yeah.
this is a great thing. If you haven't ever tried one, and you've tried to make bread in your oven and tried to use a steaming technique, kind of like I did with the bagels, that thing is a godsend. It's the greatest thing out there. And you will be able to make amazing bread in that, where you might have had a bread in here that didn't turn out very good. And the reason why is because it encapsulates all the moisture that's in the bread, and it allows the bread to stretch before the outside heat hits it so hard that the crust gets hard. Because what happens now is that the crust will get hard, and then what happens is that inside space will continue to brew and increase in size, and then what will happen is it will blow out. Or it will contain all the sides, and it'll just be like under pressure as it bakes. And so what you want is you want that pressure that is building as the air bubbles inside get to become steam and they want to get bigger. That's what happens. That's what you call oven spring. That grows up and it lifts the bread up, and if you sliced it really nicely, it will open up and just grow and become glorious.
Do you preheat your Dutch oven?
Yeah.
And do you leave the lid on?
I would say it's one of those
Yes.
things you can try. I've tried it both ways.
You want to
The
get the
bottom of my loaves
It's like-
get really dark.
You don't have to do it.
Yeah, I
You
was
could
thinking
heat the top.
trying Not, but
You could heat the top.
Yeah.
I'd say I do more trying about that on biscuits than I definitely take into putting biscuits in my frying pan and not hot. And it's better.
yeah.
Moving the loaf from the rising to the hot pan, my loaf deflates.
Okay, well, if your loaf is deflating in that phase where it's the last step right before you pop it in the oven, that typically is a sign that you've overproofed it.
Okay.
So my advice would be to potentially, there are two things that I might do. Would be pull it in a little sooner, put it in the fridge a little sooner, or put it in the oven a little sooner. Or reduce some of the hydration. Hydration is what gives it some of that elasticity, and it also weights it enough that it can fall down a little quicker.
I'm just trying to get it straight, so you're saying after the second rise, you might put it in the refrigerator, let the dough cool down, and then go to the Dutch oven, and there it can expand
Yeah.
into like a loaf?
I would say this is the way I would say, letting it do its first rise on the table, covered of course in like a lid or something. Then I will either push it out and shape it into a loaf and put it into one of these little bannetons. And at that phase, I could put it in the refrigerator right after shaping, but I still need to give it its time to do a second rise. The oven spring is not the second rise; it's extra. So you put it, if you put it in one of those bannetons, then you put a plastic bag over it and put it in your refrigerator, and you pull it out the next day. If you haven't given it its second rise yet, then I would leave it out on the counter and let it sit for another hour or two. Then popping that bag off of it and popping it into the Dutch oven and putting the cap on it and shoving it in the oven.
So
Boom.
basically, you put it in the refrigerator, you wait to bake it the next day, or bake it later in the day.
That's correct. If you don't need the refrigerator, it's not required. But it does, the refrigerator does allow for a longer time of fermentation that potentially might help flavors and it might help digestibility. The longer that it takes to sit, like if you, let's just say if you put it in the refrigerator and let it sit 3 days in there before you put it out and put it in the oven, it might taste better and it might be more digestible. You might find that it's better for your gut and you don't have the, you know, some of those gluten issues.
Do you have to let it get to room temperature before you put it in the oven, or straight in the
No,
refrigerator?
absolutely not. If you've already given it second rise and then you put it in the oven, you definitely can just go straight from the refrigerator into the oven. And I think that's the easiest thing, in my opinion. The fragility that happens when it's been sitting out, trying to get it in the Dutch oven, and then capping it it's fragile. If you let it do its second rise and you pull it in and put it in the refrigerator maybe a half an hour before you think it's going to be really ready, it'll do that extra half an hour as it's getting cold in the fridge. Then when it comes out, it'll be a little cold and stiff, making it a little bit easier to like handle it and slice it. The slicing, then it just boom.
I have another question. All this stuff, the sourdough pizza doughs, the recipes I've looked at, have adding yeast also. Do you guys, it's not what you,
We don't do that at the wheel, and I would say it's not necessary at all. I think if you want, let's just say the biggest, goofiest dough you could possibly do, maybe, you know, I'd say I'm challenged to always get my fully sourdough thing to be as high as it would be if I added a little bit of yeast. But I don't need it to be high, I just want it to be good.
so, do you have any, when you make your own pizza, do you have a ratio of how much of your sourdough starter you put to like, you're making 1 or 2 pizzas? The flour?
Yeah, I'd say that if you just look up almost any recipe for sourdough pizza, my impression, and this is over the years that I've been doing this, they're almost all virtually identical.
Yeah.
They're almost, it's incredible how similar they are.
But if, I guess what I'm asking is, if I'm leaving out the yeast, do I add more, double up the amount of sourdough starter and put
You
yeast?
go to a site like the flour maker. What is it? The night King Arthur. It has a great recipe that does not use extra starter. Extra. It doesn't. No, it doesn't.
You
add
can find
extra
all
yeast.
kinds of, and this place is also the perfect loaf. It would be, if you're looking for a pizza dough, sourdough pizza recipe, he's got it and it will be great. And again, the difference between that and the Wheels recipe and, you know, anybody else who's doing it well, I'd say I can't tell the difference. Like if you look at all the numbers and it might be a little bit different, but in the end, there's virtually no difference. All right, this is a 2-hour session. We've come to the close of it. I hope you guys have had a great time. If you have questions about Down to Earth, Rachel knows all there is to know about it.
Are you gonna talk about the stuff up here with recent
Yeah, I think
items or whatever?
I don't want to talk too long because it's time, because I know people are wanting to leave, but if you have questions about these things, this is that Dutch oven, it's in this box. It's what makes the oven spring on a regular loaf of bread, I think, so dramatically better that I'm not going to cook one unless I just don't have one of these, and I got 3 or 4 of these.
The one I'm wondering is the utensils that are in that,
I think this is a dough mover. These are little bags that go around these. This is a bomb. I don't think it's going to work for razor blade. I don't think that you really need this, although I have one exactly like this.
He said you could put the basket in the
I'll just get some of the starter if I can.
and then we resolve
I'm gonna try to get